Hello, my name is Connor.
And I'm Jason.
And you're listening to the Amazed and Perplexed podcast.
So we began what I've seen entitled the Sermon on the Plains. In my NIV right now it says blessings and woes, but there's somewhat of a corollary between this and the Sermon on the Mount. This is much shorter and is different in many respects. So last week we talked about the blessings. Blessed are you when you do this, and blessed are you when you do that. One of the things that the Sermon on the Mount doesn't have is a section. It's a relatively small section beginning in verse 24 of Luke chapter 6. It says, "Woe to you." And so that's really interesting that, keep in mind, this is to his apostles. Outside of this context, in my mind, the only ones he says woe to are the Pharisees or some community that had just outright rejected Jesus, you know? And so it's interesting that he's using this. Now it's in warning. He's not berating them. This is kind of a cautionary tale, if you will, cautionary guidance. But so when we take that in, I'm just curious. So we're already sitting there in the middle of this sermon, but what would you add as far as contextually?
Yeah, and I think this is not going to be any new ground that I cover here, but I think it's just important to keep putting in front of us. So you get these blessings, and when last week we talked about them, and we talked about how they kind of invert the expectations. It's important that we get this other side of what Jesus does with the blessings. And some people will say these go together. These are very similar. Jesus does this intentionally back to back. And part of what you can see that he's doing is it is so easy. It is so easy, even when you have somebody telling you, "Hey, Jason, the sky is blue," or the sky is blue, Jason. Well, if you grew up believing your entire life the sky is red, even when I'm telling you the sky is blue, and even if there's visual evidence, you can look up and see it, you're gonna have that creep in, like, no, I think that the sky is actually no, and so what Jesus does here, and I think it's incredibly helpful. I think one of the things Jesus does here is you get the positive of, like, hey, the people you didn't think were a part of it are actually a part of it. And what he does here is he says, listen, the signs that you think are blessings of the Father, I'm telling you that paradigm for which you have viewed things is inverse, and it's incorrect. And so it's coming at it from all sides, because Jesus is not just trying to give some like cool new coffee cup verses. He's trying to invert their entire way of viewing themselves in light of the gospel, in light of God and the good news he's bringing, in light of what Jesus will ultimately do and what they're going to be about going forward. And so not only does it need to be addressed from one side, it needs to be addressed from all sides, both positive and negative.
I love that. I remember I was listening to somebody, and I can't remember one of the words he uses. I'll just use a more generic word, but he's like, we can't become like Christ by tweaking, by just changing it, this tiny, tiny thing. And he doesn't use, it's not demolition or deconstruction or anything like that, but it basically is, you're going to have to, it's like the big jump. You're going to have to be at least willing to do the big jump, and it's precisely for what you're saying. This is not just moderating a bit. Well, I was a big jerk, but so now I'm a little jerk. It's not even about being a jerk. It's about, now I'm thinking of life totally differently. Like, what is it that God may have in me for you? And when I'm a jerk, I'm not really focused on you at all. It's all about me. You're a bit player in my story. And it just comes down to, do you benefit me now or do you not? But either way, I don't owe you anything. And then Jesus is like, yeah, I'm dying for the whole world, and I want you to be like me. Yeah. That should send a shudder through our hearts. But I think largely it's like, yeah, and I'm going to not drink as much. And it's like, oh, okay, that's good.
Yeah.
But that's not what he's talking about.
Yeah, and Jesus could go about giving a list. That could be all his ministry is, and all his teaching could be don't drink too much, don't curse, be really kind to each other. And there's elements of that sort of thing throughout Scripture. But I think God knows us so well to know that, like, ultimately, the problem in my life isn't that, like, oh, I drink too much, or the problem is that I'm not kind enough, or the problem is that the ultimate problem is that I I need to be walking in concert with my God, and I need to do that, to be acting and be a part of what God is doing here on earth, to be a part of His kingdom. I have to learn not learn. Learn's the wrong word. I have to take part in and have my mind completely reoriented to the new rules of the kingdom that were completely contrary to the old rules that I assumed would be a part of this kingdom.
And I think what you just said there, that could be a modern day translation of Romans 12, where he says, do not be conformed to the world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. It's that readiness to have my mind renewed with whatever God has, trusting Him so much that what I'm basically saying, as you renew my mind, as you give me new ways to think about life, then you're going to change me to be more oriented towards your point of view or aligned with your point of view. That brings up a lot, but I think that's really good. So here's what I'm feeling now about this. I don't want to read this passage because I'm already anticipating what is it I extol as signals I'm doing well that He's about to tear down. This is there's a book, The Jesus You Never Knew. This is the Jesus I never like because He's hitting targeted points. I'll go ahead and read that now, starting in verse 24. But woe to you who are rich, for you have already received your comfort. Woe to you who are well fed now, for you will go hungry. Woe to you who laugh now, for you will mourn and weep. Woe to you when everyone speaks well of you, for that is how their ancestors treated the false prophets. Okay, now, to be clear, this continues. So I don't know what the next verses will say, and the first verses still apply, the verses before this. But man, that's a penetrating section of Scripture. So for you, what hits you? I immediately have some things I'm really perplexed by. But what hits you that amazes you?
Yeah, I think, man, I think it's just incredible to me. It's incredible to me how even these things that Jesus goes down when He talks about being full, not being hungry, being rich, even the extent of laughing and enjoying life, and being well regarded. These are all things that these graph on pretty well to our modern society. They're not as hard for us to understand, wanting these things and seeing them as good and trying to get them and go after them. But I think for me, it's so incredibly beautiful because this is just going to sound so basic. It's just the simple truth. We as followers of Jesus, we know if you chase after wealth and ultimately, you're not ultimately, that's not going to fulfill you. If you chase after X, Y, and Z, if you eat for happiness, you're ultimately not going to be satisfied. There are just these basic truths. I think there's a lot that Jesus is doing here, but I think He's also speaking to a basic reality where if what's going to bring you happiness, what's going to bring you ultimate joy, what's going to fulfill you, what's going to make you the way you always want to be, if you think it's because you're rich, or you think it's because you're well fed, if you think it's because people laugh at your jokes and like being around you, if you are basing your okayness, basing your life on any of these things, then those things turn to ashes eventually. If all of your life is based upon these things, then those things are temporary and will ultimately float away. And so for me, it's so simple, but it's a reminder that I need to keep it at the forefront, because all of these are a temptation for me to want to rely on every single day. Every single day, I want these things. And there's a part of me, if I don't try to kill it, if I don't try to die to myself, will begin to believe the lie that, just that little more money will be better, will make everything better, will bring me that satisfaction. Man, if they see how cool I am, they see how kind I am, then maybe those feelings of insecurity will go away. I am just constantly drawn to want to rely on the things that Jesus talks about here. And I'm so thankful that He gives this, because it speaks directly into my life.
I 100% agree. That resonates with me deeply. Before we started recording, I was relating to you some experiences I had recently where I was down with the missions program that I was a part of when I was younger, and just trying to see if I could be a blessing to some of these students as they transition out of the program into going to college, getting a job, whatever they'll do after that. And really feeling way overprivileged by some feedback I'm getting from people there. Simultaneously, within that same conversation, I was sharing, there were these very specific people I so wanted to bless, not in this context, but in other contexts. And then I don't know, I think they don't want to talk to me anymore. I think there's one in particular. I'm like, yeah, if I ran into him, I think he would do everything he could to avoid me, and I hate that so much. And then I'm stepping back. Well, why do I hate it? Do I hate it because if he was full of the love of Christ, he wouldn't avoid me? Or do I hate it because I think he's mad at me? Or this is a signal that I'm incapable, that I was incompetent, that I wasn't good at my job, and then deeper accusations I will make. I'm not lovable. I'm not trustworthy. I'm not, these kind of things. And then when I say it like that, I'm like, oh, that makes me want to love that guy even more. But 20 minutes ago when we were talking, I don't know. I was admitting pride, and I recognize also it's a little bit of self-pity. Yeah. It's like, oh, why would God keep asking me to do this if he didn't make all my experiences shiny and beautiful?
Well, and it's ultimately, it's viewing that first 20 minutes ago version of Jason. It's viewing those people through what can they do for me? Thinking about them through the lens of pawns on our chessboard, and we're all guilty of that. And so I don't want to cast condemnation on you right now, but I know for me that is a constant battle, and why I so loved the idea of giving dignity to these people in these and in these stories, because it's so easy to rob the dignity from these people and make it all about yourself. But when you begin to realize, oh wait, that those people that I have those uncomfortable feelings with, they're actual human beings who God is working with, that God loves, that they're part of the story, then man, if you then can begin to do the work of turning that over to God and realizing not just the truths of who God is in this story, but who the people that you're having conflict are, and man, that for me is the key. Is the key to that sort of inner contentedness that I so want.
I think that way. I have a question, and this is a pure ignorance question. I don't know if you'll know it, but in the way the NIV does things is when it's doing, if you're looking on the page, when it's doing these, blessed are you and woe to you, and then there's a shift when it gets to the next section about, but to you who are listening, I say, love your enemies. And it's writing this down as if it's a quote from the Old Testament or some kind of poetry. I don't think it's a quote from the Old Testament. So I wonder if there's some way to understand. If I was studying this on my own, I would note, is this poetry? Is this fall? Are these blessings and woes? Is there something purely Jewish that helps me understand? It's like when you realize, oh, this is a parable. This is not a doctrinal thesis. It's a parable. And it doesn't mean it's not true. It's just a picture. And man, that picture can be interpreted a billion different ways. Whereas when he says love your enemies, that's love your enemies. And I'm not suggesting he's not saying woe to you. But poetry communicates a little bit different weight. And maybe that's not the right word. So I don't know if you have insight into that. But if I'm studying on my own, I would note that and then go look and see, hey, I wonder what more light this might shed on it.
Yeah, I don't have an answer, but I completely echo. My assumption is there's something deeper there that we probably would be blessed to dive a little deeper in.
I mean, not for this podcast, but yeah, for real study.
We're not going to stop right now. But even in that, there's that trust that okay, there's going to be something. We're talking now. We're 13 minutes in of talking. Maybe we'll talk for another 15, 20 minutes. Maybe we have another tangent we go on. It's 45 minutes. But hey, there's going to be a layer underneath. There's going to be this other area of discovery, which is, I think, at the heart of what we do.
That's exactly right. Exactly. And just a reminder, especially if you're new to the podcast, this is us coming to a text. And it's like first blush interaction. Now, we've interacted with this passage most likely before, but we try to hit it as fresh as we can, and we're just trying to get comfortable asking what amazes us, what is really super cool to us, and simultaneously what bugs us, what perplexes us. Specifically, what amazes me is, and this is a constant in Jesus, but this is just a new presentation of it, is that dynamic of him saying stuff that he knows will bug people, will confuse people, will shock people. Now, if you're the person that never gets a laugh, if you're the person like you're like on your little profile, like I'm not funny, not rich, I don't eat well, I'm never comforted. This is great news for you. If an app came out that says, hey, if you fall into the non-woe people, this is your app. I mean, that'd be really good news. But for most of us, and Rich, we understand. The people he's talking to that are rich probably don't make as much money as I do in terms of buying power and in terms of
quality
modernization.
of life.
Yeah, exactly. And technology I've had, the types of food I have. I can eat meat every meal and do typically, and they might go without eating meat for a while. So I am the rich guy in this story, even though we would say, well, that's middle class or whatever. But it's like, yeah, so I'm the bad guy in all of this, if you will. I'm the woe to me. And exactly as you're saying, every one of these are markers for, am I doing well? Mm-hmm. If they don't pay you for something, did you have any value in the first place? And so that's just one indicator to me that I'm in the woe to crowd. more naturally in this story.
Yeah, I think that's helpful, and I think how we interact with these ideas, because we are not, first century peasant farmers, most likely in the Middle East. That's not who we are. How we interact with these things is incredibly. It's not. I don't want to say incredibly difficult. It just needs to be nuanced in how we think about it. We need to give the dignity to the people that Jesus is talking to, the disciples, and the possibly surrounding people receiving the teaching. But then I think there's also the other truth to remind ourselves that this also does pertain to us. Like, I don't think if Jesus came today, he'd be like, well, listen, you don't have as bad as 2,000 years. I don't think he'd frame teaching in that way, or frame our lives in that way. And I don't think Jesus would frame it that way. And so I think it's just important to take it with some nuance, and to think about, to give the dignity to the people, but then also recognize how much more our own privilege puts us in peril. How much more the comfortabilities that we have, how easy it is to exist compared to them in the past, maybe even be a disadvantage to attaining the sort of life that Jesus talks about. And not in a like, well, we have it harder sort of way, but just in recognizing there are some truths that Jesus is explaining here about what it's going to be like in the kingdom of God. And there are things that our society ultimately esteems and raises up, and in fact, things we are just born into that makes it harder to live out the way that Jesus called us to live.
I think, that leads me directly into what perplexes me, and it is this part of finding the nuance. It is the part of finding the balance. There are places in the letters where he talks about, hey, you need to, like elders, hey, you need to have good reputation. You know what I mean? Well, what's good reputation? Well, that's people speaking well of you. Jesus at one point, I think it's Luke 10, where he's full of joy, and full of joy is different than joy, because full of joy includes jumping. That's like one of the defining pieces of that, which is so weird, like jumping for joy, Jesus. It's just, beyond the alliteration, it's just a weird image to have,
Oh, for sure.
So he's got to be laughing. He's got to be at least smiling big. So he's not saying, and the other parts, and I think this is where the contrasting context are so important, is like, he's not saying have a bad reputation, although sometimes Paul and Peter and Jesus had bad reputations in certain pockets of people. I would suggest the people saying crucify him weren't like, but he's got a great rep. They had to tell himself on some level, this guy's bad, and so it excuses me to call for his death, kind of thing. So he's not saying, hey, I don't want you laughing, I don't want you impressing or encouraging and impressing people, blessing people. He's not saying, I never want you to eat well. Paul says, look, I've learned what it's like to have plenty and learned to have none. So the key here, and you got to this with the amazing piece, it's, although you didn't say it this way, but it's this idea, where is my dependence? Where's the part that keeps me going? And so, borrowing a little bit of Paul's, I think it's Philippians, the content and non-content, it's that idea of saying, I've learned what it's like to hit a perfect mark and make everybody laugh and feel great. And I've learned what it's like to be rejected, and I trust God with both. See, now, and I'm not suggesting, wow, Jesus really needs a rewrite here. Although maybe if he was here, he would, because we listen different than this culture. But I do think that helps me, you talking about nuance. So there is still this perplexing piece, because now if I put it on a continuum, one is, man, Jason's a funny guy. And the other is, man, Jason can handle rejection, and Jason can handle, stone-faced audiences. Where's the balance there? And this age old.
Yeah, no, it for sure is. Well, and I think the thing that I'm kind of drawing out of just this idea is I do think Jesus would communicate this to us in a different way, because now I'm reading this over again. I feel like there's a natural progression for what the apostles and the disciples would expect. They think, oh, the Messiah's come, and that means like there's this new reign coming, there's this new kingdom, there's overthrowing, which means, man, we're gonna have money. That means I'm not gonna have to go to bed hungry anymore. That means that like we're gonna be at parties and people are gonna want to be friends with us because we know Jesus. That means that that we're gonna be well renowned. That people are gonna be like, can you believe that he came from my village? Can you believe? Like, and so all these things I think naturally flow from what they think the fruit of following Jesus is, of what the fruit will ultimately be. And so I think for me, the thing that I want to draw away from this are, what are the things that I think are the natural fruits of following Jesus that aren't in the scriptures, that aren't actually the things that Jesus talks about. And I think that Jesus, possibly, if he was doing this to us, he would communicate it in a different way, because they have expectations for what it is to follow the Messiah that are wrong. And I think he's addressing those here. And then there are things that I have believed whether it's by my own fault or by what I was taught, that are the natural fruits, the natural things that are going to happen when you follow Jesus. And Jesus be like, hey, listen, Connor, I need you to understand those things that you assumed actually woe to you if you think those are the things that are going to save you.
Outstanding. So what perplexes you?
Yeah, so I think, and maybe this is a problem with my own heart in terms of reading Jesus. It's really easy for me to imagine, like, I've got the Jesus movie playing in my head, and I'm reading through, and I'm imagining what's happening. It's easy for me, like, man, blessed are the poor, and blessed are, like, I can go through all the blesseds, I can go through the whole Sermon on the Mount, and there's this beauty, and like it really, it connects super well, right, with the first thing that comes to my mind when I think of Jesus. The hard part for me, and it's not perplexing about Jesus, it's just perplexing for me about how I can better have the best picture of Jesus in my mind and how I can best understand him. Because of the way I think I was, maybe the way I was raised or the tradition I came up in, there's a natural desire to not run away, but to shy away from the direct confrontation of whether it be sin or bad habits or just the negative, focusing more on the pot. I think that's ultimately in most of the church history in the West from like 1900 on was negative based, and then my generation is reckoning with, hey, that wasn't all of it. There was this positive side, and so that pendulum swing of back and forth is just so hard for me. And so for me, I can see the beauty, right, in this. I can see the beauty in the woes, and I can see all of the good things that Jesus is doing and communicating to the disciples and to us today. But for me, the perplexing thing for me is it would be easy, because at first glance this doesn't completely connect with the positive Jesus maybe I've conjured up in my mind. And how often am I doing that and skipping over this like good teaching that's here, this good thing that ultimately I don't even think it's as negative as my brain wants to make it. I think it's negative. I think there's certainly things that are scary and are we're meant to guard against. But I think so much of oftentimes when I encounter something that Jesus says that makes me uncomfortable or that I think comes off as mean, I am so quick to shy away from it or explain it away that ultimately I miss out on not just the good things that Jesus has to say and the deeper meanings, but also just miss out on this piece of who Jesus is that ultimately I don't get the fuller picture, and ultimately that means I'm lacking and I am not fully getting Jesus. So yeah, the perplexing thing again almost always comes back to it almost always comes back to like I want more, I don't get it, and it makes me feel uncomfortable. So yeah, that's where I'm at with that.
It occurs to me that when Jesus, I don't know where that is, 5 or so chapters from here, it occurs to me that when Jesus is talking with the Pharisees or teachers of the law, and he's talking about woe to you this, woe to you that, I like those passages so much more.
Oh yeah, because
I see every critic I've ever had, I'm like, oh yeah, that's what you were doing. That's what you were doing. And so it does occur to me, oh yeah, it's also interesting to me. It introduces this section and it says, large crowds of disciples were there. So this is not just the 12 disciples who would become those sent, the apostles. These are, it's a bigger group, a large, whatever large is, but larger than 12. And then it says, then there's a great crowd around them. So what are we talking about? There are 500 people, 1,000 people here, whatever. But anyway, it's curious to me what I'm supposed to take in about, and this ties directly to what you're saying about him. It's specifically saying, and he looked at his disciples. Mm-hmm. As in contrast, they just said there's a large crowd. He didn't say he looked at the people or just simply he began to teach. So it's very intentional that we recognize this is for the people that were already buying in and liked him. And I don't know if this connects back. Maybe this is to the amaze part, but that piece of this heavy reorienting, for those that already believed. Mm. He's not telling this to the non-believers. I contrast this with John the Baptist. When John the Baptist is preaching, there's at least one time, and you get the sense this is probably a repeated action, where all kinds of people were coming, and I don't know even necessarily if they're all being baptized, but they were saying, hey, what should we do? What should we do? Oh, you soldiers, you do this, and you do this and this and this. And this is Jesus talking to people like, we're in.
Mm-hmm.
And he's like, okay, if you're in, love it. I love it. You're welcome. And this is the other thing. We can't get his body. Is he saying, woe to you, side eye, sneer, glaring at, these three guys? Or is he like, hey, woe to you? And what's being communicated? Man, be real careful here.
Mm-hmm.
This will hurt you. And it just changes. And the truth is, I don't know his intonation. I have some assumptions because I know how much he loves his disciples. But I also know his disciples, I mean, honestly, even a year from now and 2 years from now, they're imbeciles. Mm-hmm. They're just like, he's saying, hey, here's A, and they're like, B? And he's like, no, Yeah. So I'm like, how are they, early on, because he just picked his 12 right before this, and then you have this other group of people. That's the other thing is, ouch, it just occurred to me, 12 is there, the 12 are there, and then Mr. 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 150 is there that didn't get picked. So how is that playing?
Oh, yeah.
I don't know. It's just fascinating to me.
And I think there's a piece here for me. I'll speak specifically for me because I know Jason shares some of my thoughts, but maybe doesn't have as much angst around it as possibly I do.
Give me your angst.
It's the young man's angst. I struggle so much. I struggle to know or to believe or how much I should care or how much I thought I should put into it about how we do church, how many people when they say they're Christians are actually following Jesus, are actually being disciples. That's something Jason and I have talked about, many times. That number possibly scares me. The people that are bought in, who are the ones that are actually bought in. And so I think the thing for me, and it's something that I'm always constantly struggling with, because I was going to say, I think statistically, there are statistics that show like the people that are actually attempting to be discipled by Jesus, being formed and made and actively changing into the image of Jesus is smaller than the number of people who would claim the label of Christian. I don't think that's that controversial. The thing for me that I'm taking out of this is there can be a lot of anger for me and frustration that we seem to set up our churches to produce that fruit. And the thing that I think for me that's maybe going to be helpful for me just going forward and having a better mindset and thinking about this is, like you said, these guys are already bought in. They've already decided to follow Jesus. And they're still needing to have their paradigm shifted and inverted completely, not just a few weeks in the following Jesus, but a year or 2 years or 3 years or 4 years down the road. And Peter long after having many different things inverted. And so I think the thing for me is I need to remind myself, I need to give dignity to the disciples here that they're bought in. When they said when they chose to follow Jesus, they actually were choosing to follow Jesus. There wasn't some sort of fake following Jesus that they really figured it out later down the road, that they actually chose to follow Jesus here. And so I need to I always need to have more grace for everybody. But two, recognizing just because there possibly are a lot of things that need to be turned upside down in the way that we view God and church and follow after Jesus, Jesus would be like, yeah, those are my disciples. Why wouldn't those be your disciples? Why wouldn't that be you, Connor? And so that's just something challenging I'm going to try to take in.
That is really encouraging. I like being in the audience and you're on this plane, which I always think it's funny when he's like, and they all went to a plane. It's like, all right. I mean, if you're not going to have more description, why have that description? He could have just as easily been disembodied floating around, in the storytelling aspect of it. I don't believe he was disembodied. Jesus had a body. All right. I'm not a Gnostic. Anyway. Yeah. Anyway. So, but it's a fascinating, okay, we're on a plane. And the other thing is, this is just any given Tuesday to them. Like, it's not like, oh, wait for it. Here comes the sermon on the plane. The music didn't change in the background. Like, oh, this is going to be important. And he just starts talking, and then he's through it. And my assumption is they also heard the Sermon on the Mount. My assumption is he spoke like this many times. And this is just two representations of a sermon he would speak repeatedly to people. Because most of the time it's like, and Jesus taught and healed, and next story. So this is an exploration of some of the things he was teaching when he wasn't engaged with a question. Now, once you get past this, most of the time he'll just say Jesus was teaching, or Jesus was engaged with some question or situation, to heal or to do something like that. And so I think we should assume that he kept teaching this way on and on, which that's fascinating. The disciples hearing this message, woe to you, if you're well fed now, how are they thinking about it? They don't have a place to lay their head, and, sometimes they probably eat well, sometimes they don't. They're out there with the grain. We looked at that a few weeks ago. That's fascinating how much he would say it, and then they do it, and he'd say it, and they do it, and they'd say it, and they do it. Anyway, But just that idea of being there, and you would receive this casually. It's like when you and I are talking, when I come into your house and we're chatting, I'm not thinking, man, I better write this down. You know what I mean? But you, truthfully, you are a representative of Jesus Christ to this generation, and then I'm a representative of Jesus Christ. So we should never assume, well, Jesus is not going to give me anything here. But man, when it gets all of a sudden, I guess if I said, hey, Connor, just a few things, woe to you for ... all of a sudden it'd be like, oh, I'm thinking different. I may not like it, but that's it. And to be clear, I don't think I'm Jesus. I don't think you're Jesus. But he says, we are the hands and feet and the shoulders to cry on and these things for Jesus that reproduced him through the Spirit. So I just think it is a fascinating thing to stand there with them. And maybe they're like, when are we eating? Or it's pretty hot on the plane or whatever, and just it registering and it's sowing seed though. That's really important. They didn't have this written down that they studied 20 more times.
Yeah. And it's helpful to, like, there are things that Jesus says here that then the disciples later on will completely, like, if they treated this as the be all end all, one of the two main sermons that you would preach, like, there are things that they say later on that they'd be like, well, hey, you remember back on the Sermon on the Plain, Jesus said specifically this. And so, like, what you're saying kind of doesn't add up here. But like you said, this is several years in the making. It's one of several different times this happens. And yeah, it's giving them grace, but then also remembering, okay, that's incredible. Because obviously this specific instance had such an impact on somebody listening to Jesus that they remember this one specifically, but then for somebody else it wasn't. And that, I think, is just always important to keep in our minds.
That is, I know we need to end, but that just put it in my mind. I'm in heaven and I'm like, hey, Matthew, hey, Luke, come here. Tell me, why did you do the Sermon on the Mount? Why did you do the Sermon on the Plain? Why is it? I think Jesus said all of this, but it is fascinating, the differences in personality. Remembering, even as you're reading a writer, I believe you're reading Holy Spirit inspired content, like what it says happened, I believe happened, but it is through their telling.
Yeah. And
I guarantee you, if you ask my wife and I how yesterday went, you'd get a little bit different story, And I didn't even mess up yesterday big. She was not mad at me the whole day. I considered it just great.
Well, but it sounds like you're due for today. So.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I'm going to get home to get that fight in.
So in that spirit, we're going to sign off. Grace, peace, and love. And hopefully you can also maybe go 2 days. That'd be awesome.
Awesome.